Okay, so there's a few things I want to say around the latest attacks in London, and hopefully this won't be too repetitive from previous videos. There are a few talking points I think need to be discussed. A quick disclaimer or a quick explanation, I should say. By the way, that's smoke, just in case you're wondering, it's from incense. Yeah, I seem to be having a problem with the upload speed at the moment, so by the time you watch this video, it will probably be a few days after it's uploaded, which is frustrating, but the upload time seems to be taking a long time at the moment, so that's unfortunate. But anyway, that's the reason why. I want to talk about some of the issues around this latest attack and some of the things that we really need to do as a society. I want to quote Maajid Nawaz, who's a man of a lot of respect for because I think he talks a great deal of sense. He is one of the world's top experts on pan-Islamism. One reason being is that he himself is a former Islamist. Um, he was never convicted of terrorism, but as a younger man, he did flirt with extremist groups like Hizb ut-Tahrir. And since that time, since he started to back away from this path that he was going down, the Stark path, he's dedicated his life to counter-terrorism measures and combating this ideology of Islamism. So he's taken basically four approaches that he argues we should be doing as a society to help to combat this. Number one, we have to call it what it is: Islamism. He has made the point this is a very specific ideology. It's theocratic in nature. It's political Islam. Um, Majid Nawaz has never been one of these people that says, "Oh, it's got nothing to do with Islam." However, he does differentiate between Islam, the religion, and Islamism as a political ideological movement. And I think that's a position that we have to consider because the sort of pan-Islamism that we have been seeing is a relatively modern phenomenon, going back at most a few decades. And it's obviously elevated in the past 2 decades, in the 2000s and in the 2010s. Um, there has always been examples of violence within Islam, no question about that. But this particular nature of pan-Islamism is something that is relatively modern. And he's making the point, though, that we have to call it what it is. Now, Theresa May did in her speech. There's a few other leaders I don't believe will. Can you really imagine Prime Minister Caroline Lucas standing up and talking about Islamist extremism? No, she wouldn't. And there's other leaders of the left who just will not bring themselves to do that. Um, the second point he made was we have to stand up for the Prevent program. Prevent has had its fair share of controversies, but basically, Prevent is the government's anti-terrorism outreach program. There are those who promote the misleading narrative that it's an agenda against Muslims. Actually, it's designed against all forms of extremism. So there's also intended to monitor, for example, neo-nationalist or white supremacist extremism. But there are people who promote the idea that it's against Muslims. What Majid Nawaz says that anyone who understands anything about national security would not take any politician seriously who is honestly suggesting at this time we scrap Prevent. That would be a complete disaster, I think, because it would be basically the government saying, "Oh, we failed," and you know, it's allowing the Islamists to claim the narrative that they are the victims when they're not. They are the oppressors. I'm not just talking about these attacks in Europe. I'm talking about the way they oppress people en masse in the Middle East. I mean, those who really want to present them as freedom fighters or even, are tempted to go down that route that it's all a rebound effect. Like they're just acting out of Western policies. They're totally ignoring the fact that these people enslave fellow human beings in the Middle East. It's I think you have to be very careful about going down that line of trying to argue it's all rebound. Certainly, they use it in their propaganda, but it's a very dangerous and misleading sort of path to take because it then gives them some sort of credence as being, just standing up to imperialist Western policies. It's a very dangerous and misleading narrative. It also ignores the fact that Nigeria, the Philippines, and Bangladesh have all suffered serious Islamist violence. None of those countries had a military presence in the Middle East. So, what do you do with that? Take that one away. So, to those who want to make excuses for ISIS and say, oh, but they're just acting out of Western policy, or another one is the West created ISIS. Let's get one thing straight. ISIS created ISIS. Anyway, the third point he made was, as I recall, let me get this right. Oh, my mind's just blanked on the third point. Yes, to have a counter-intelligence agency or officer mediating or acting between different government departments, because as it stands, according to Maajid Nawaz, since 7/7, there hasn't actually been a specific counterterrorism um, officer or operative. I would I would even think about making an extra department for this, but there needs to be something that mediates between, for example, the Department of Justice and the Home Office, um, in order to be basically promoting the same message. Because if you get, for example, the Department of Justice saying one thing and the Home Office saying another, it doesn't give a great deal of credibility to the government being unified on this. So I think that's an important point you made. Number four, we have to defend our values. This sounds like a cliche, but it is true. That is what Islamists want to do. They want to kill us. Um, some on the right have been very critical of the calls for unity and to stand by our way of life and so on because they perceive that to be about denial. Well, certainly I've been very vocal about those on the left who won't even mention Islamism, and I remain vocal about that. I remain very concerned and very frustrated by that because I think it's a big problem. However, there is something to be said for getting on with life. Now, there was that tribute concert in Manchester that Ariana Grande, to her credit, held. 50,000 people turned up. There was a gentleman in London, and you had to admire his spirit. Very high spirits. He actually went back to the restaurant in the Borough Market to pay for his meal. He said the emergency services were fantastic. He said the staff were fantastic. And he said he would continue to go out to meet handsome men. Obviously, this guy was gay. And socialize with powerful women, which is exactly what the terrorists don't like. Now, he didn't say Islamist, but there is something to be said for that mentality. I mean, London's an ancient city, and it's seen much, much violence throughout its history, far, far worse than what we saw last night. I mean, look at the Blitz. And this sort of stuff can sound like a cliche, but I think it's about getting on with life, continuing to go to concerts. I think it's right that the general election continues on the 8th. I think it is right that that hasn't been cancelled or postponed. So getting on with life, but at the same time not treating this as the norm. There is a reason why terrorism is responded to in a different way from, for instance, a car crash or smoking deaths. There is a different emotive response. I think it's because it's a particularly vicious aspect to it that it's man-made. It's Islamist thugs who are doing this. These are people who want to inflict terror. They want to kill. And this is what differentiates them from terrorists of the past. Terrorists of the past certainly killed innocent people, but the primary purpose was to put pressure on governments. The primary purpose was to send out a message. Even the IRA, which done some awful things, and I wouldn't for a second downplay that. Even in some of their attacks, they made telephone warnings and so on, beforehand. With the Islamist agenda, it's simply, to cause as much pain and misery and destruction as possible. It's just random, wanton violence. Well, it's not random, of course, it's planned, but what I mean is they're not demanding ransoms. They're not demanding, they're not even calling on the government to change particular policies. What they want to do is kill. So, calls for unity and vigils and so on, I do think they have a place, actually. I wouldn't be totally cynical about that. I really do think they have a place. But clearly, it's going to be difficult to see this happening every single time there's an attack. Um, we've now had three major terrorist attacks in 3 months. 34 people dead and scores wounded. The attacks are different in nature to 7/7. The London bombings of 2005 were on a transit system, and the casualties were significantly higher. So, what we seem to be seeing is, I wouldn't say small scale attacks, these are major attacks, because let's not overlook the injured. But in a way, it's more dangerous because they're not using necessarily bombs. Obviously, the Manchester bomber did, but they're using vehicles. Now, if you ban vehicles from central London, they're just going to go to the outer boroughs. There's plenty of venues in the outer London boroughs that they could also target. The truth is, Sadiq Khan got a lot of slack when he said this, but I think the point he was making was he alluded to the fact that it's impossible really to completely guarantee that we can stop terrorism. He said something along those lines and he got a lot of slack. I think people misinterpreted him as saying, "Oh, we should just not care about it." That was not what he was saying. He was making the just factual point that this is the reality that we are facing, and there's no foreseeable end of this in sight. So what I would suggest is let's not live in misery. Let's not think, "Oh, where they're going to attack next," and let's. But at the same time, we cannot treat it as normal. There's nothing normal about someone mowing people down and then getting out and randomly stabbing strangers because of the death cult that inspires them to do that. That is not normal, and we shouldn't normalize it. But I think as a nation, we are going to have to maybe adapt to the reality that this is what we are facing. I think Maajid Nawaz's points were very valid. He also said that in an interview with CNN, it's difficult to actually have a profile of an Islamist because they're not all exactly the same. Whilst most of them are young men, the Westminster attacker was in his 50s. There have been women apprehended as well. Some are converts, some are lifelong Muslims, some have regularly went to mosques, some rarely go to mosques. So it isn't that easy actually to have a direct profile of an Islamist. One mistake I think the neo-nationalist, populist right, whatever you want to call them, make is by only focusing on mosques. Certainly, I think we need to take some pretty radical measures. For example, I would propose giving ultimatums to mosques that are alleged to be harbouring Islamist hate preachers. Either expel these people or you'll face closure. So we can be doing concrete things. Um, Another step could be mandating that all sermons are given in English rather than Arabic, given that most people don't understand Arabic. It would be very easy for a hate preacher to get around that. There's all these little subtle things that can be done that would not constitute, demonizing the entire Muslim community. Um, these things can be done, and they have to be done. We have to really take this problem seriously. In her speech, Theresa May said that there's too much tolerance of extremism in our society. I'm not sure specifically what she was referring to, but she may have been talking about the regressive mindset that always wants to downplay this and always takes a narrative, oh, it's only a few individuals. The problem is, it isn't just a few individuals. We're talking about thousands of people who've downloaded extremist material. That's potentially thousands of terrorists. Now, let's say there's 2 million Muslims in Britain. The majority of them are not terrorists. But even if it's a small minority, it's a significant small minority. And that has to be taken very seriously. There was a BBC analyst made the point that something like 3,000 people are now being watched by MI5, and there simply isn't the manpower to watch them 24 hours a day. So it seems to me that a practical approach would be, rather than having 12 personnel assigned to one person, narrow that down, maybe have a few people working for GCHQ or MI5 monitoring that individual and spread it out more so that there's more individuals being monitored. I have no problem in terms of civil liberties with people who have clearly indicated Islamist sympathies being closely monitored. Because the first question people always ask is, why was this person, released? Why did they not follow up on the surveillance? I think where there is credible intelligence that someone is going to act on something, or even if they've expressed extreme ideas. Another point I would make is, just because an imam condemns terrorism, just because an imam condemns an ISIS attack, is no indicator of moderation. I mean, the Didsbury Mosque, Maajid Nawaz made this point, is alleged to have sympathies with Al Qaeda. So that's like the pot calling the kettle black. Just because they criticize ISIS doesn't mean they're moderate. The real question of moderation is, what is their views on blasphemy? What is their views on apostates? These are the questions that need to be asked. As a nation, we just have to be assertive. It's not about living in fear. It's not about pandering to hatred. Um, I think Maajid Nawaz talks a great deal of sense, and simply put, we have to acknowledge what we are facing here. I'd be very surprised if this was the last attack. I think there will be more. I think we're going to see a similar wave of attacks as France did, and that's awful. But at the same time, let's not live in misery. Statistically speaking, you're still extremely unlikely to die from a terrorist attack. That's just a fact. Remember the 65 million people in this country. But it simply isn't true that there's only a minority of individuals, like a small number of people, who are harboring extremist ideologies. Unfortunately, it's not a small number. It's a disturbingly high number. Um, there's a lot of things we could do. Isolating them in prison is a big thing, because you don't want a situation where a petty thief goes in for, say, shoplifting, then he comes out as a hardline Islamist because he or she has been exposed to a hate preacher. I think there's a lot of things we need to look at, but what we absolutely cannot do is be afraid to talk about this. And the regressive left, frankly, infuriate me with their attitude sometimes. The second they hear the word Islamist, they think that you're attacking all Muslims. Not at all. Unfortunately, there will be some people who do that, and I don't think it's the right approach. I mean, those who say let's ban Islam, it's stupid because it's simply not practical. Islam should be scrutinized, it should be questioned, but banning Islam isn't feasible. So, thanks for watching. Let me know your thoughts.